not talking about corruption. Then I'm going to talk quieter. You can turn me up because I'm not going to last today. Not corruption like in tender procurement, but corruption like as in the evil. From Genesis 4 to Genesis 6, we have as many as 1,000 years. It could be a lot more. There are 10 generations listed, and as we touched on in session 1, they purposefully left out a lot of people, okay? So it's at least 1,000 years. It could have been many thousands of years. And the snippets that we have, we see advanced technologies. I'm not talking about computers, but they had advanced engineering. They built civilizations. The fact that they could even do some of that tells us that the world grew significantly. When Noah's flood came, the fact that he could build this boat tells us that there was technology. In fact, in one of the images, there's a crane. And I thought about, like, yeah, I guess he would have needed a crane. They had the technology able. Don't think Adam and Eve as some, Neanderthal, let's build a boat. No, these were highly advanced societies. And every snippet we have that talks about pre-flood people is that they were amazing. They were mighty in deed and in mind and in what they could accomplish. So 3 chapters, at least 1,000 years is covered, let's say. The covenant with Adam continues. It's not done away with. And we're still in the dispensation of conscience, and we are still in that today. So some of the covenants that God made continue on until this world is done, until something else comes about. Let's go into it then specifically with Genesis chapter 4 and 5. Verse 2, Genesis 4, verse 2. Then she bore again, this time his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. Look at chapter 5. Genesis chapter 5 and verse 4. Genesis 5 and verse 4, after he begat Seth, so there's the 3 boys named, Cain, Abel, Seth. The days of Adam were 800 years, and he had sons and daughters. So we have Cain, Abel, and Seth, but there were lots more, okay? Certainly there was no birth control in those days. It doesn't mean that we would assume that gestation was still 9 months, but the fact that we have the years explained to be very long, and we're going to show a chart of that. I do believe these were actual years. I do believe people lived much longer back then. And it's quite feasible if conditions were changed significantly that men and women could live significantly longer. I read about a guy right now. He's in his 40s or 50s. He's got mega money, and he's trying to live to be the first guy to live to be, I think, 200. And he's doing insane, crazy things. I really don't wish evil upon him, but it would be ironic if he were hit by a car or something. And I don't wish that upon him, but you can do whatever you want, but life is in God's hands. And some of the theories that have been posed at how could life have been extended, it is very feasible. Not in our world today, but in a canopy type environment, a greenhouse protected environment where none of the harmful rays are, and a highly concentrated oxygen environment, you could create an environment where mankind could theoretically live significantly longer. Another point that we don't deal with much in our notes is, who did Cain marry? He married his sister. Now that just sounds gross to most of us, but think just a little bit bigger. Only in the last 100 to 200 years, mid-1800s, probably 1900s on, has it been illegal to marry people of a close relative. Only in the last 100, 200 years has the gene pool finally become small enough that there's damage done when a brother and sister marry. For thousands of years, it has actually been practiced where Abraham married his half-sister. Sarah was his half-sister. We find that consistent throughout societies and cultures, and especially if there was time between it, it's only gross or undone to most cultures in the last 100 years. But for most of humanity, it actually was practiced. Any question or comment about that? Marrying sisters or cousins or things like that? It just doesn't sound right. For thousands of years, it's been quite common, actually. And it is probable that they had, who knows, maybe Cain and Abel had 20 or 30 children. The idea, be fruitful and multiply, that it seems their bodies were much healthier than ours, that they were able to do much more things than ours, that they built cities. And when we say city, we think Witbank, Middleburg, Gauteng. When they said cities, Abraham set up a city and there were only 300 souls, but they still called it a city. So when you read back into it and you say there was a city here and a city there, don't think Pretoria and Durban, think small city states. Think more of a tribal mentality, even throughout more recently in our African history, where you would have this tribe and that tribe, and they were relatively small groups, probably just in the hundreds. Clive, you're calling me for some reason. Your phone is. Let's move to further on in the story then in Genesis chapter, go back to Genesis chapter 4 and verse 3. In the process of time, it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Lord. Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat. And the Lord respected Abel and his offering, but he did not respect Cain and his offering. And Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. So the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? And why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not well, sin lies at the door, and its desires for you, but you should rule over it." That is a very difficult phrase to interpret, and the meaning is questioned. And we're going to pose or think about a few options here. A couple things to observe. First of all, on the issue of worship. This is not the first time worship has taken place. It's the first time we see that it's described to us. Did Adam and Eve offer sacrifices? I'm sure they did. For how would the boys have known to do this? I'm sure sacrifices happened. This is the first recorded instance of worship. It is interesting that worship always involves an offering. Am I pushing that you need to give more money to the church? No, I'm not. But you cannot worship God unless you are sacrificing. Even David said that. He said, I cannot give something to the Lord unless it costs me something. Because the man said, hey, take it. You can give it to the Lord. He said, no. We find a lot about the theology of worship, and you have to begin here, that if I'm going to worship the Lord, it might involve my singing. Now in our day, when we think worship, we often think singing. But in the ancient world, if you said worship, they would have thought sacrifice. I must bring something of mine to God. It must cost me something. And I think the older understanding of worship is better than the new one. If it doesn't cost me anything, it's not worship. Singing doesn't cost me anything. Maybe my pride a little bit when my voice cracks, but singing is actually a very small part of worship. The music portion of the church is the last thing in my mind. It's like, I've done this, and now I want to praise you. But if you look at the theology of worship, it must begin with a sacrifice. It must cost me something. Now, when the Bible says, it's interesting that they both brought first fruits. And that's a key. When I teach on giving, what should giving be? I do think giving should be faith. I'm trusting God. It should be first fruits. It should be in correlation to what God has given me. And it should also be, I have another F word, faith, first fruits, and it should be free will. The Bible consistently says, give what you want. Give what you want. And the church doesn't come and check on it. It's free will. Every man as he purposes in his heart. Now, in the Old Testament law, they mandated a tithe. But we find tithing was done with Abraham. They knew about it, the law. And we find no legal stipulation on the church to give 10%. If you want to give 10%, fine. I think that's a good thing to do. But it should be in relationship to how God has blessed you. It should be in priority to God. The harvest came in, and I give you first, and I give you best. Those are keys to our worship. So why then does God not like Cain's? Any ideas on this? And the Bible doesn't say. So, any ideas? Why do you think God liked one and not the other? Oh, you guys got some opinions. Okay, let's go with you first.
I was thinking Cain gave out of abundance rather than give out of what was meaningful. Like, let's say he had a lot of wheat, so he'd rather give wheat than maybe millet or something like that. I feel that it was more.
Okay, and that is theorized. Maybe God said it must be this, and he said, well, I'll just do this. Maybe he gave the wrong thing or something like that.
The state of Cain's heart, maybe.
Maybe the offering was actually okay, but the motivation. Okay, maybe that. Somebody else? Clyde?
Maybe the next verse alludes to that a little bit.
No, don't go to the Bible. Which verse?
You just read it. If you do good, will your offering not also be accepted? So
Okay.
the implication is he was offering, but not.
I never thought about that. Maybe his actions were evil and he thought his sacrifice would then still be received. Okay. Tabula, I saw your hand. I never heard that. So to give an offering from the ground was not appropriate. It must be an animal. We also, theology works back and says it must be living. There must be blood shed. And we do see blood. But the blood sacrifice was only introduced in Moses' day. And the point of him giving the blood offering to Moses is making a point like, and I've given you the blood. So in my mind, it wasn't mandated before. On the point of some from the ground, in the Mosaic law, they did also bring things from the ground. So, I don't know. So I'm not here to verify any of you, but the point I would like to make that is God looked at it. When it says he regarded, God says, I'm looking at it. Just because you sacrifice something doesn't mean God's happy with it. And I think that's an important lesson. So just the theology of worship, just because I do it doesn't mean it's accepted. And we find that certainly in John chapter 4 as well, where the Samaritan woman said, I'm going to worship here, I'm going to worship there. And Jesus said they must worship him in spirit and in truth. The heart must be right. The motivation must be right. So those are some of the ideas we brought up. But how you do it must also be right. And I would tend to think that his heart was wrong and probably the sacrifice was wrong. I would probably say, but something in there, God says he looked at it. Now, there's another thought to do with this, with his envy. And look at the text here, what it says when God comes and talks to him. Verse 7, if you do well, will it not be accepted? And if you do not well, sin lies at the door. And this last phrase, and its desire is for you, but you should rule over it. That is not an easy statement. One writer theorized, and I can't remember if it's in Doug's work or if I read it somewhere else, that Cain thinks he's going to lose his birthright here, that now Abel is accepted and I'm not, I will lose my supremacy as the firstborn. And so he kills Abel to recover the firstborn status. I don't know that. It doesn't clearly delineate that. But this aspect of its desire that you have now been replaced as the one I talk to. Certainly Cain, Esau, and Jacob, the firstborn was replaced by Jacob as the one that God would talk to. So he has anger, and then jealousy comes into it. Anger is mentioned several times, and we think jealousy and envy because something is happening. So in verse 8, he talks with his brother, and he killed him. Seems he may have been buried. His blood cries out to me from the ground in verse 10. The ground is again cursed, or you are cursed from the earth, which is open up to receive your brother's blood. So the ground, again, in verse 12, when you till the ground, it shall no longer yield its strength to you. Was this a curse just on Cain, or was it also on the ground itself? And then a fugitive and vagabond shall you be on the earth. And it's interesting, we also have one of the first mentions of mercy. We certainly have mercy with Adam and Eve. But Adam and Eve ate a piece of fruit. Cain committed first-degree murder. And yet he is spared. Therefore, whoever kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. It's not only mercy, it's grace. God says, if you kill Cain, I will judge you. And I don't understand that, but God put such mercy upon Cain. Now, just as a side note, and I'm purposefully doing more on theology because it touches, these first chapters of Genesis touch on so much of theology. But on the issue of capital punishment is a highly volatile topic. And people often argue from, they just argue. Get your theology right. Capital punishment was instituted after the flood. Noah, Genesis chapter 9 or 6? I think 9. I think chapter 9, when they came off the ark. In Romans chapter 13, it does state, from God's perspective, government has the right to capital punishment and to wage war. Government has the power of the sword. Government, within certain parameters, has the right to take life from God. And we think of the sword as war, and we think of the sword also as taking of life. However, when you get into the issue of capital punishment, some people, and this is my background, say capital punishment for every capital offense. And others say no capital punishment because it's human life. Capital punishment was actually instituted because of the image of God and the sanctity of life. If you take life, your life is forfeit. Because the life you took was so precious, you lose yours. So both sides are arguing for the sanctity of life. One focuses on the life that was taken, and one focuses on the life that remains. We are actually both focusing on the same thing. So I'm just trying to temper your heat on this debate. And here, in the very first instance of capital offense, God did not commit capital punishment, did he? Nor did he with David. And so God and a government also have the right to say, we won't use capital punishment. And on this topic, my position has morphed over the years, and now capital punishment is so often done in the world because of political crimes, and unjustly, I think the prevailing occurrences of capital punishment are actually quite wrong and bad. Similar with corporal punishment in South Africa, 80% of spanking, 80% of corporal punishment in South Africa is physically abusive. And so when you have something like that, it's so imbalanced. I think we should be very careful in pushing for something, because a lost world, if you say, I'm for capital punishment, I'm for capital punishment, so much of what has been done with capital punishment is not biblical. So if you're going to argue for it, just make sure you argue for it on biblical grounds and not on what is being done here. So that's my soapbox issue aside. Any questions about it? But we do find it touches on it here. Any questions or comments about capital punishment?
Can I go one back to the giving?
Sure.
If you think of the first harvest that comes in, and then you give the best to the Lord. In today's terms, you would think if you get your salary, let's say you get your salary, and what you feel you can give to the church, you do.
Okay.
So I'm just wondering, how do you decide what to give to the church itself and what to give to somebody else here? Say you go to the road and you give that guy
Okay.
$10 or whatever. Does that count as part of the giving, or should you rather give it to the community of the Lord?
That's a great question. That is a fantastic question.
Priorities in life by the church.
Anybody have some good help for him? I'm a biased source. Kyle, any good help?
I agree. Some of them you just not quite way. But Jesus does, or not Jesus, but someone does state that whether you give to a non-believer or you give to a believer, God will still take into consideration.
Well, the idea of a cup of cold water, it's your act where we give, I give to them, but I do it unto the Lord. It's not who receives it as much. Yes?
Does not say in James that faith, love, action is there?
Yeah, and the context there is helping somebody be warm and filled, and I give them no food. So the idea of kind works and good deeds, I think, should be prolific from the life of a believer. Anybody else? Tabula? Okay. Okay. Clive?
So I know this is going to sound very biased, but I'm just going to tell you what the Bible says.
Again?
At the end of Philippians, Paul thanks the church. So they sent a package literally providing clothing and food and basic living necessities to Paul. And he thanks them and he says, this is an offering acceptable to the Lord. And he says it's like sweet fragrance to God. Now in the temple, when they
That's good.
I'm just putting that little bit out there. You can use it to make up your own mind.
Well, no, there are some
But-
good principles, and I think there's some good thing in 1 Corinthians 16 when they're raising funds to help another church. So it's not even for their own church. So it is application. It says on the first day of the week, let everybody set aside as he's able for that. And the idea that it's regular, it's measured, it's in relationship to, the Bible teaches if you have much, give much. If you have little, give little, but everybody does something. So I think it's good to have a practice in place for the church. To Bula's comment about that love and good works and that we are kind, some people I have found are very regimented because of their personality, and everything is down to the penny. And some people do that in order to make themselves feel good, like, see what I did? And other people, that's just how they are. And others are more free-spirited. And I think there's benefit to both, but sometimes the free-spirited person needs a bit more order and just regularly trusting God, and I'm going to give every week. And sometimes the person who's regimented needs to also just, no, I've already given to 5 people at Robots this month, and I'll have 5 next. Needs to give, so I think both 10%. And Julie and I, when we got married, our giving was completely different. And we've actually flipped. And she is a lot more generous now, and I'm tighter, and that's not good. And I'm more regimented, and she's more free. So I think maybe even Lindy and you will probably help each other. Sometimes you just do it because you want to. Okay. Sorry? Oh, yes, sir. Next.
Then on the issue of corporal punishment and wars and the government's right to go to war, I don't know if you've seen the movie Hacksaw Ridge, I think it's the name.
You gave it to me. I still haven't watched it. Okay.
Okay, but the principle is that it's not according to the laws of God to go to war. And
Most wars are bad, yeah.
yeah, but we're supposed to be, Jesus is Lord of love and not of war, and we should submit ourselves in that manner as well. So is it still today seen that you can go to war or not? I think we should.
That's a huge thing. For 300 years, the New Testament church were pacifists. But to join the Roman army as a believer was to take the sword against your own brother, because the Roman army also inflicted a lot of pain on the Christian community. And so it's unfair today to say Christians must always be a pacifist. The sword can also be not just war-like active, but also self-defense. And some believers say even in self-defense, I should not inflict. And others disagree and say, I would carry a firearm, or I would, if you were coming for my kid, I'm not a big brawly dude, but I'll do what I can. So the idea of the sword is also for self-defense and protection. And it does say to protect the good. So that is a big debate. My personal position is that lethal force in acts of self-defense is acceptable. It was acceptable in the Old Testament law. You could take life. And governments, I think most governments, all governments are corrupt and evil to a point because they're man-made. And most wars are for greed and jealousy. I think most wars are bad.
And the fact that the Lord says that we should not judge, He will be the judge.
And yet he said, pay unto Caesar taxes, and he also said, so if you'd like, I can do some more on this. It's a massive issue. There's Christian ethics is a dedicated study, and I can give you some really good material, and it's a really difficult one.
I don't know how if this even ties in, but it does say that war is not against flesh and blood, but against strong.
Yeah, talking about our spiritual, so I'm not going to get over sin with an actual sword. And one time Jesus said, put your sword away, and another side he said, take your sword. So it's a big one. But I can give you some material if you'd like to read further on. Okay, I'm going to... No, that's fine. Just the one comment about Jesus made this comment, and we certainly see it in Cain and Abel. I just want to then go, I think with a smaller group, if you'll allow me, I'll take 3 or 4 minutes and just finish today so we don't have to pick it up. Seth, his name means appointed, and when he was born, he said, the Lord has appointed unto me another man, and the way she speaks is that not just to replace Abel, but this would be another one. This child will know God. And the Bible says that when Seth was born, people started to be called after God. And the idea is they would say, you are of God's people. You are Seth's descendant. Doesn't mean they were all automatically saved, but Cain's descendants did not seek God. And Seth's descendants, at least for a while, did seek God. And that phrase is very important when you get to Genesis chapter 6. We're going to come back to this. So I'm just introducing it to you. We're going to show this map or this chart again, the length of life. You know that they were living almost 1,000 years. Methuselah means when he passes, it will come. And he died in the year that the flood came. There's an interesting comment about capital punishment with Lamech as well, but I'm going to move on. But I'd like you to look at Genesis chapter 6, and we'll pick up on it next week with another C called Captain Noah. But let's just introduce it today. In Genesis chapter 6, it talks about giants. Genesis chapter 6, verse 1 and 2. Now it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and the daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives of themselves of all whom they chose. If you just stop there, you would, especially after just hearing about Seth, I would think, that now the sons of Seth, the sons of God, the ones who are being called after God, are now marrying maybe daughters of Canaan. And that is the nice, easy interpretation. I think that's the one that Doug proposes. And I keep changing what I think about this text. And it doesn't have a lot of implication to our lives. And the last time I taught on this, I agreed with Doug. But now I think I disagree with Doug. Are you set on your position? Okay, so we don't disagree. But look at the next verse. So he's not set either, but the safe view is that these were the sons of Seth marrying the daughters of Canaan. Verse 3, and the Lord said, my spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, yet the days shall be 120 years. There were giants on the earth in those days. And also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men and they were born children of them, those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. So there's different theories. This word, I thought I gave it to you. Huh, I didn't. Nephilim? What was it? Nephilim? Okay, I know you've got a theory about it. I'm going to dismiss for coffee, and then you can go talk about it. The word giant there means fallen ones or mighty ones. I have no problem with giants being in the land. We have found prehistoric footprints of men. In Texas, you can see a footprint of a man in the footprint of a dinosaur, proving they did live at the same time, and the man's foot is quite large. I have no problem with giants living on the earth, even from folklore and stuff. But because the word is fallen ones, some have theorized that these were demons or the fallen ones to earth. I have a problem, this theological problem, because in the Bible it says angels are not given in marriage. It does not mean that they cannot be sexual. It does not mean that a spirit cannot take upon the body of a man and have sex with a woman. So I don't know. But it says, it connects it to the evil, and it also connects it that what came after this union, these were born, these children that came out, these were the mighty men of old, men of renown. So by the time of Noah's day, this is one of the snippets I was talking about, civilization was highly advanced. There were men of renown. They were mighty. They weren't just mighty in size, they were mighty in evil. And the same type of language is used of Nimrod as well. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That's not a good thing. He was phenomenally evil and wicked. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. He was known for hunting humans. He was known for doing all kinds of evil. So don't just put your surface understanding into it. These are some very difficult phrases. But whether you think they were giants of some demons or whether you think as sons of God shouldn't affect your devotional life tomorrow. It sounds like Kyle's got some opinion on it. Go have coffee with him afterwards. But look, and we're done. Look at verse 11, 12, and 13. Here's our word. Verse 11, the earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. That's a reference to those mighty men. They were mighty men of violence. So God looked upon the earth, and indeed it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. So that's our C for today, corruption. Not financial corruption, but that mankind could not govern himself, and it tended towards evil and violence. And next week, Lord willing, we'll be doing Captain Noah. So I dismiss you to tea and coffee and your discussions about giants. I'm not getting into that one. God bless you.